Hello and welcome. We'll begin this video by talking about events and indicators that I speak of as signs of the times. Over a period of years that have passed through the more recent period in the lifetime of the speaker, myself, one could hardly read, watch, or listen to a news report without having some event or set of circumstances called to one's attention that upon examination would certainly be considered by many today as a sign of the times. One of the first questions that some might ask in regard to the previous statement is, what signs and what times are being discussed here? And that, of course, is a legitimate question. Those who study biblical prophecy in the Judeo-Christian Bible would respond by saying that the times would certainly be a period that they called the end times. They would then add that many of the signs are those events and circumstances described in the Judeo-Christian Bible, including descriptions in the books of Daniel, Matthew, and the Revelation, as signaling that the end times have in fact arrived. Some of those so-called signs, although they're not identified as such, have already been discussed in previous videos from this series. Excuse me. The term end times refers to a time described in the Judeo-Christian Bible in the book of Matthew, chapter 24, verse 3, when the Christ, being one with the Master Jesus, is privately asked by his disciples this question, "And what shall be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" This King James Version translates this less correctly as the end of the world, but it is the end of the age. Also in the book of Matthew in chapter 28, verse 20, where Jesus says, "Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Thus the term end times. There are a number of other sources that talk about similar times, although they don't have the stature that most people in the so-called Western world normally give to the Judeo-Christian Bible. One of the earliest of these is Nostradamus, a man who wrote a substantial number of verses that were called quatrains. He organized them in groups of 100, which were called centuries. His writings have been read perhaps by more people today than during his own lifetime. A more recent personality was that of Edgar Cayce, whose readings spoke fairly extensively of future times. More recently still, a woman named Jean Dixon made a number of prophecies, although I would not compare her directly to Nostradamus or to Edgar Cayce. Nevertheless, many of her prophecies were also written regarding the period of time near the end of the previous millennium and the beginning of the current one. And even more accurately, the end of the age, meaning the Aquarian age, and the beginning of what we call the Piscean or Piscean ages, depending on how you pronounce it. If the time in which we live today is the end time, meaning the end of the age or the period of transition from the end of the age of Pisces or Pisces to the beginning of the age of Aquarius, as I believe it to be, and if that which has been written about this time period is correct, then we must assume that the next 10 to 20 years or more will be an extremely difficult time for the entire planet and for all of us who call it home. This 10 to 20 to 30 year time period is that which I described earlier in the book as the long dark tunnel into which we entered at breakneck speed on September 11th, 2001. Currently, one of the most visible so-called signs of the times is the fact that multinational corporations are and have been buying one another as well as buying other companies at an astounding rate. Excuse me. These buyouts are often based almost entirely on paper. In addition, the stocks bought and sold in the world stock markets are often overvalued to a greater degree than cautious wisdom would dictate. These and other factors, in combination with greed and lack of consideration for anything except greater profit, or at least not significant consideration for anything except greater profit, cause a substantial portion of the foundations of many of the world's largest economies to be based on little more than a house of cards, which the winds of change quickly and easily toppled in the autumn of 2008 with the manifestation of the worldwide financial collapse. All of this at that time was much to the dismay of those who had therein the base of their wealth and power. Much has been done to prop up and rebuild the financial system, and as of this speaking, the stock market has rebounded, and many of the very wealthy who invest in it are now doing exceptionally well once again, especially with currently low taxes on capital gains. However, changes have not yet been adequately made to properly and completely correct the fundamental causes that brought about the devastating collapse that is still being borne on the backs of the masses of the people. Regulations have been passed to help prevent that from happening again, but they are so filled with loopholes and this, that, and the other that they really aren't going to prevent a major worldwide catastrophe from happening again if the conditions are right. Another sign of the times in today's world is one that saddens me deeply. That is the fact that despite substantial gains made since the 1960s, there are still in the world underlying currents of racial, ethnic, and religious hatred that run so deeply that I marvel at the great masses of people over whose minds and hearts these strong currents of hatred still hold sway. The prejudice that manifests itself in so many ugly ways, including murders, mass killings, and even wars, continue to take place in the abhorrent name of racial hatred, ethnic cleansing, and religious fanaticism. These are only some of the many negative manifestations of these deep currents of hatred. The very sad irony of all this particular kind of hatred is the fact that those persons in whose minds and hearts the hatred is most deeply rooted will, in their next or subsequent incarnations on this planet, become one of those very ones who are the object of their own unbelievable hatred today. Until this madness is stopped, they in their next lifetime may be the ones over whom the dirt is being shoveled in some mass grave of that future day and time. Another sad aspect of these very serious problems of racial, ethnic, and religious hatred is the fact that the flames of such hatred are often kept burning by a few who are in power, and or by those who have the power or wealth to gain or to maintain through the widespread continuation of these conditions. For example, those who sell arms and so forth. Those few seldom miss any opportunity to fan the flames and thereby maintain or worsen the status quo. This allows them to keep the people so busy fighting amongst themselves that they're not aware that others continue to pull the strings that allow them, the others, to keep themselves in power, those at the top. There's no question about the fact that such conditions are widespread throughout the world today. Sometimes they're openly visible, and at other times they're present as an underlying factor affecting the lives and well-being of millions of people throughout the world. It was relatively hidden, it wasn't noticed, and there was indications that there were indications that substantial progress had been made in racial hatred. But since the election of Barack Obama as President of the United States, many in his own country and some others more quietly in other parts of the world are outraged that a man of color has attained such high office, and they're determined to do everything in their power to cause him to fail in his endeavors to improve his country and the world. How very, very sad. This racism, bigotry, and religious hatred must be stopped. We must develop greater tolerance and learn greater understanding of the points of view of others who do not see things the same way that we do. And they, of course, must do the same for us. Sometimes even the most complex problems can be resolved simply by approaching them from a point of view that gives us the opportunity to better understand the premise of the matter. We can often see things more clearly when a set of circumstances that seem complex and unfamiliar can be analyzed in a way that lets us see the similarities that these circumstances have to other circumstances with which we are more familiar. In order to help us better understand and therefore improve our chances of resolving some of those very difficult problems, let us therefore take such an approach in the matter now under consideration. Follow along as we explore the colors of our world. Regarding these colors, I can still recall the amazement that I felt as a child when I first saw the colors that are created by sunlight shining through a prism. They were the same beautiful colors that I had seen in the sky many times after a period of rain, when the sun would suddenly appear, creating a brilliant rainbow of color. As I became older, the beauty of those colors did not dim. Even today, I still can't seem to avoid taking a moment to admire the natural beauty in the colors of a rainbow, or to notice when the sun shines through the prism that's part of the little glass hummingbird that hangs in our window and creates a bright splash of colors on our wall or on our floor as the sun shines through it. From a more scientific point of view, most of you are probably aware of the fact that when our eyes are operating properly, we see different colors in a very interesting way. When sunlight shines through a prism, the prism separates, so to speak, the various colors of which the sunlight is composed, the colors of the spectrum. And we can see that the light is made up of different colors within that visible spectrum. Each of these colors has a particular frequency within that visible spectrum. And by visible spectrum, I mean the range of frequency of the light within the electromagnetic spectrum that is visible to the human eye. Variations of color are variations of frequency within that spectrum. The lower frequencies are the reds, followed by orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. When light shines on an object, such as a chair, for example, that we call a red chair, what really happens is that the chair absorbs all of the colors of the spectrum except red, which is reflected back to our eyes. The same is true of the other colors and their variations. What we see is the color of the light that's being reflected back to our eyes, while colors not seen have been absorbed and are not reflected back to us. I'm sure that's oversimplifying things a bit, but that's essentially what happens. Humans generally enjoy seeing color in their surroundings, and we are all affected by color. For example, red seems to stimulate us. As a result, many restaurants use red in the color scheme of their interior design with the idea of stimulating our appetites. Other colors will have different effects on us to one degree or another. There are some who use color as a form of therapy to help bring about a positive influence on certain maladies that seem to respond positively to that kind of treatment. People in our society will often go out of their way to place flowers in and around their home as a way of enjoying the beauty of so many variations of nature's beautiful colors. We sometimes plant flowers outside our homes as a way of beautifying our yard or our garden. Beautiful arrangements of flowers of all colors are often used as a way of honoring and showing respect for those who have passed on and for their family. We often find that we each have our favorite colors and often choose our favorite flowers based on the size, shape, and beautiful colors that are available in the many different varieties. Many prize the delicate beauty of roses of one color or another, and there are many varieties and colors from which to choose. Others prefer the comparable delicate beauty of the orchid and its many varieties and colors. When we create our flower gardens, we often make it a point to choose many different varieties and colors for the flowers that we plant there. Many gardeners have found through years of creative planting that the most beautiful flower gardens are often those with the greatest diversity in the size and color of their flowers. For some rose enthusiasts and for some who prize orchids, both the black and the white roses and both the white and the black orchids seem to be among the most prized because of their great beauty and for the diversity that they bring to the garden as a whole. With only the white and black flowers, however, we tend to find a feeling of starkness until other shades and colors are added to complement the whole. When the gardener has a plan, all of the flowers and colors seem to come together to create a garden such that the result finds the whole far greater and more beautiful than the sum of its parts. Over a period of many years, I have come to see our planet as being somewhat like a great and beautiful garden, created as a part of God's plan. In His garden, the earth, there is quite a great diversity of human beings. You might think of us as the flowers in His garden. Every one of us is here for the contribution that we each make to the garden as a whole, while at the same time we each have made the decision to incarnate here in order to have the opportunity or opportunities to learn the lessons that this environment can provide. The lessons that each person needs are known by that person's higher self, and we're each guided by our higher self for the purpose of helping us to learn those needed lessons. The lessons are unlikely to be exactly the same for any two persons. During our lifetime here, however, there's no doubt in my mind, as indicated earlier, that in addition to coming here for our own purposes, we're also here as part of a larger plan, and that we all have our part to play in the creation of the garden in accordance with that plan known only to God, the Master Gardener. We are of many different variations in size, shape, and color, and as a result, we've divided ourselves into categories. One of those categories we call race, and along with other considerations, it is based quite often on the color of one's skin. There are also differences in religious beliefs. At first glance, such a distinction would seem to make those of us in each race very different from those in other races, and those of one religion very different from those of other religions. But are we really? Within each major variation of color or race, there are so many striking similarities, and that's more true than most people realize about different religious beliefs also, that it's very difficult to come to any conclusion other than the obvious one, that despite our differences, we are all God's children. It would seem that we can all enjoy having a loving relationship with someone whom we consider to be special when the other person reciprocates by returning that feeling to us. We all seem to value very highly the children that often result from such relationships. We all indicate that we want to have sufficient food to provide a healthy sustenance for our loved ones, and a decent home in which to dwell so that we and our loved ones are protected from the elements. For all those in such relationships with their chosen partner and their children, if any, we find almost universally that one or both adults seek some means of providing the necessities of life for themselves and their family. This is a way of saying that they all want employment or self-employment or some reasonable means to make it possible for them to provide these necessities in order to help make a decent life for themselves and for their loved ones. In addition, we all place a high personal value on our close friends. Where religious beliefs are concerned, most thinking people have come in the course of their lives to the realization that a power greater than their own has a much greater connection to human beings than even those who profess to be very religious are aware. And those who have not yet come to that realization are very likely to do so as they grow older and hopefully wiser. All of these things point to the fact that despite our differences in color, race, or religious beliefs, etc., there are still countless ways in which we are nevertheless all very much the same, since we're all human beings and we're all the children of God, living in His garden that we call the earth, a relatively small planet that is a part of God's universe. Not only do we live there, but that's where we've been placed, either by our higher selves or by God or some collaboration with those, between those. All of this having been said, why do we much too often feel distrust, or at times even hatred for those whom we consider to be different from ourselves? This difference doesn't always concern itself with color or race or even religion. But for the purposes of this discussion, we'll focus primarily on those aspects of our differences because of the very great pain that has been brought about, directly or indirectly, to so many of us over such a long period of time as a result of the feelings that many of us still have about those differences. Let me state again, because of its importance, just as it is in our own gardens where every flower has been carefully placed with loving hands to create the effect according to our plan that we desire, can there then be any doubt in your mind that it must be equally true that every flower, meaning each of us in God's garden, this world, is also there for a purpose according to His plan? In our garden, each flower has a significant contribution that it makes to the garden as a whole, and the diversity of size, shape, and color, etc., all play an important part to make our garden in its entirety much greater than the sum of its parts. It makes perfect sense then that in God's garden also, every flower, meaning each of us, is here for a purpose, and according to a plan that's known only to God, the Master Gardener. But each one of us, regardless of size, shape, color, or religious beliefs, makes a contribution to the garden as a whole, a contribution that only that particular flower or person can make. And all of the flowers come together as humankind to create a garden, our planet, that, when complete, is far greater and more beautiful than the sum of its parts, than many of us might imagine. At the same time, having a place in that garden allows each flower, each plant, each of us, to grow and to develop as we seek to reach our own full potential, our point of greatest contribution to the garden, the highest level of spirituality of which we are capable in this life, and thus to gain greater individual spiritual growth while still contributing significantly to the garden as a whole. There's a duality here that allows us to have the opportunity to use our time in the garden to learn the individual lessons that we came here to learn, but at the same time to play an important part in the overall plan of God, the Master Gardener, to learn the lessons we need to learn as a people, as humankind, while we play our part in His master plan. We hold ourselves back when we allow anger or hatred, especially when unjustified, to rule our lives. Trust me when I tell you that to have anger or hatred toward another person or persons because of their religious beliefs, or because of the color of their skin, or because one or both of your parents had such feelings, or even because of some isolated incident in your own life, is unjustified to the extreme. I can say the same thing about people of opposite political persuasion. Think about that. The negativity and the anger and the hatred that one puts out into the cosmos at such times will always return sooner or later to its source, you, the person who sent it out. It's very unlikely that those who have and who nurture such feelings will spend one or more lifetimes living in a body with the skin color that they now hate, are following a religious belief that they now hate and persecute, or perhaps both, in order to put them on the receiving side of those feelings, to truly, literally walk in the other person's shoes, all in order to help them learn that there is a better way to feel about and to interact with our fellow humankind. So many in our society love the look of the sleek automobile in almost any color imaginable. And it's common to see people with clothing or goods of many kinds, material things created in many beautiful colors. When it comes to association with others in God's family of children, however, meaning other humans whose skin is different in color from our own, or whose beliefs or whose lives are substantially different from our own, then all of a sudden mistrust and doubt, or even anger and hatred, can all too often enter the picture. As an example of such feelings, I would like to relate a personal anecdote that shows how feelings of prejudice still pervade the minds and hearts of far too many people. A good many years ago, when I worked in a peripheral capacity for a sales organization, I recall that a new sales representative was needed in the organization, and I suggested to the sales manager that he hire an African American to fill the position. He laughed at what he considered to be my naivete. I was aware, however, as was he, that a person of color would have a more difficult time with some of the buyers who would not want to buy from anyone of color. I nevertheless felt that every inroad would be a new beginning that could help bring about positive change. What I did not know until then was that the sales manager seemed to feel the same as some of those buyers. He would not have given even slight consideration to hiring a salesperson who was an African American, or any other person of color, or someone who might be considered different in some way. Like others in his position, he knew all the right things to say and treated all applicants courteously. But there was no chance that he would fill the position in the way that had been suggested. It saddened me greatly as I realized that the same scenario was undoubtedly being acted out in this country and in many other countries of the world every hour of every working day, when people are considering others to fill open positions at every level, from CEOs on down. Discrimination is not always as obvious now, but it is still a very significant factor in employment and in many other areas yet today. I'm aware that many positive changes have come in the years since the incident I described, and the recent election to the presidency of the United States of a man whose father was born in Africa is a very positive indicator that many people in the United States are making significant progress in their thinking about such matters. But if you don't believe that this is still a very serious problem, look at the demographics of the unemployment statistics along the lines of race. Don't try to tell me that people of color don't want to work. The number of applications being submitted, even for a single position, are mind-boggling. Work is part of our nature and our culture. The problem lies instead within ourselves as individuals and as a society that permits the continuing practice, no matter how subtle, of bigotry and racism. Looking at the United States and too many other countries around the world, we can see that such problems still exist wherever such prejudice exists, and the prejudice is not limited to race. Wars are still being fought over ethnic and religious differences in many parts of the world. Do you remember the sense of a great sadness you felt the last time you read in the newspapers or saw on television that one child in a family somewhat purposefully killed a sibling, or brother or sister? Remember how your heart ached for the parents? Will we as a people ever come to the realization that this is exactly what we as God's children are doing to his other children, to our own brothers and sisters? How do you think the parents of such a family feel about the child who did the killing? How do you think God feels about those of his children, humanity, who commit such an act upon their siblings, their fellow human beings, and insist all the while that they're doing it in his name? Think about it. Think about it until its significance really sinks into your consciousness. We must begin somewhere, sometime. Therefore, why not here and now, to educate people to the fact that we are all, as I've said repeatedly, God's children. And He is as displeased as you would be if you were the parent of a large family and there were some of your children who mistreated or even killed a single one of your other children, their sibling. Take heed, for nations as well as persons reap what they sow. It's never too late to change your mind and your heart to allow greater understanding, greater tolerance, and yes, even love for those who may be different or even think differently than yourself. Thank you for watching. You're encouraged to watch the next video and the subsequent videos in this series. Once again, thank you.